Welcome to the Reimagined Energy Remix series. I'm Maria McGowan, and in this special series, we dived into the podcast vault and picked a topic that was mentioned often: electric vehicles. Coming up, we'll break down the big question: how do charging needs vary from Atlantic to Western Canada? Plus, with the federal government mandating that 100% of new vehicle sales be EV by 2035, what does that mean for utilities, the grid, and fleet charging on the go? So, whether you're an EV enthusiast, a skeptic, or just EV curious, let's hit the road. Forecasting models, they can be, region specific. The Atlantic Canada can differ from Western Canada. How can that be? It's something to do with load profiles you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things at play here. I'd say, I'll talk about load profiles in a minute, but just in terms of the potential for adoption of EVs in different parts of the country, I think that's where we look at, what are some region-specific barriers to adoption, and so that can be things like whether we're focused on very urban environments or more sort of rural areas, which have very different implications in terms of charging infrastructure. I think a lot of people, their first reaction is to think that EVs are really a city thing, and rural folks would have a harder time. I actually disagree with that. I live on a farm. I think EVs are great for folks that live in rural areas because we drive a lot. And so back to that economic argument, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of that potential long-term savings, because every kilometer you drive, you're saving a lot by switching to electric, to an EV. And it becomes just a question of, how do we make sure that there's enough public charging infrastructure to cover the longer distances that you might see in a rural environment. Contrast that with an urban environment where access to charging is much more complicated. If you live in a rural area, you probably have a driveway, much less likely to be the case if you're in, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, places like that. And so we do a lot of work with those local governments. And I'd say with those bigger cities, those challenges around access to charging are really top of mind. And yeah, beyond that, there's also just questions about the demographics, and certainly, at this stage in the game, we see that, with EVs being more expensive upfront to buy, certainly the hotspots for EV adoption are more the more affluent parts of the country. And so factors like that can really have an impact on the potential for adoption. But on the side of load profiles, that's sort of the next step, especially when we're working with electric utilities that are trying to understand what are the implications for their operations, how much load is this going to represent for them going forward. That's where we really need to take into account, what are the travel patterns in different parts of the country, how far do people drive. Climate certainly has a big impact as well, because at colder temperatures, EVs consume a lot more energy. And so these are some of the important factors that we need to take into account when figuring out where and when do these vehicles charge, and what does it mean for the electric utility.
In December of 2023, Ella, we both know, the federal government announced that by 2035, 100% full adoption of EVs in Canada. So what does this mean for utilities, let's say, and the grid and the infrastructure? I mean, that's a pretty substantial target to reach. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think, first of all, there's one point of confusion that I think is really important to address. And sometimes that target gets discussed and people misinterpret it to think that means that 100% of the vehicles on the road must be electric by 2035.
Like new sales or something.
Not at all what's being. Exactly. Yeah. And those are two very different things. So that means that as of 2035, you can no longer buy a new gas-powered vehicle, but we'll still have gas-powered vehicles on the road probably till about 2050. So as far as that planning goes for electric utilities, some people ask the straw man argument: can the grid handle all the vehicles being electric, and almost suggesting like that's going to happen overnight. What's working in the favor of electric utilities is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. Even once we hit that target of 100% of new sales in 2035, utilities will still have another 15 years or so before every vehicle on a driveway in Canada is going to be plugging into the grid. But I don't want to underplay the challenge here. It is pretty substantial, and there's a lot of work to be done on the utility side. We work with utilities in just about every province, developing load forecasts to understand, how quickly is this load going to materialize? And if anything, those targets that have been adopted by the federal government really help electric utilities in terms of knowing what they need to plan for. I think until, we've been doing this kind of forecasting since about 2018. And in the early days, there are a lot of questions. We would do our best to develop forecasts, but there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether this trajectory was really going to happen. Now that you have a federal target that's locked in, it really helps the utilities and the decision makers at utilities, and also the regulators that need to approve utility plans. It helps them really recognize that this transition is on its way and that we should be taking steps proactively to anticipate that. But I would say in general, when we work with these utilities, they there are challenges ahead. They're going to need to do some work in terms of expanding capacity in certain parts of the grid. But if anything, they see EVs as honestly one of the easy challenges ahead of them, because EVs are inherently very flexible. And what I mean by that is that you come home with an EV, you plug it in maybe at 5 or 6 p.m., but you generally don't need a full charge until the next morning. And with people typically driving about 40, 50, 60 kilometers a day, on a level 2 charger, you only need about an hour or two of charging per day. And so there's a lot of flexibility in terms of when that charge can happen, and a lot of potential for utilities to encourage off-peak charging. And if anything, turn EVs into a net benefit for the grid in terms of increasing usage of the grid assets, increasing the revenue for the utilities without necessarily driving higher costs. And looking a little bit further into the future, potentially even being able to leverage these EVs as a distributed form of energy storage. And so if utilities can figure out the right programs and policies, they might be able to encourage EV owners with some kind of financial incentive to allow the utility to tap into that energy storage during peak periods, and help use that kind of storage to accommodate an increasing penetration of variable renewable sources of generation. So I think in general, the quick answer to this to me is go to just about any electric utility website in the country, and you're likely to find some page on their website that tells you how awesome EVs are. And that wouldn't be the case if utilities were really concerned about the impact of EVs on the grid. I think overall they see a lot of potential here, and it's just a question of staying ahead of the curve and making sure they're prepared for this load growth.
Something you had mentioned earlier, and it I never really occurred to me, was when electric vehicles are in transit. Let's say they're in between dealerships, or they're just moving from point A to point B on a transit truck or a train or what have you. And those need to be charged. Like they need to, they need to be topped up. So, what's involved, and what does this look like, this in between destinations?
Yes. Yeah, if you look at that, that's a good one. If you look at the entire manufacturing to delivery of that product, just that charging infrastructure alone is like its own marketplace, because you're absolutely right. And the concept is no different. We can draw the comparison on that one to an internal combustion engine. If we're here in Halifax. Halifax is a port city on the Atlantic Ocean. We bring in the majority of European vehicles into Canada through our auto port here in Halifax. And just like an internal combustion engine, it would not leave the Audi or Mercedes manufacturing line in Germany with a full tank of gas, right? Because now you've got 1,000 vehicles with a full tank of gas. It's an explosive source on a shipping vessel. And the same is true with batteries. You wouldn't ship that vehicle with 100% charge because of the stored energy in the battery and the fire hazard that would create. So the comparison is identical. And then, the amount of charging infrastructure. And one of our favorite projects, or my favorite projects we've worked on as a manufacturer of EV chargers and software, is CP Rail, so Canadian Pacific Rail. So we provided fast chargers for all their facilities. So let's take that use case, Mercedes new all electric vehicle, ships from Germany, lands at the auto port here, right? It will need a top up. So we've got infrastructure there at the auto port, gets on the rail line. CP Rail has fast chargers, not only for the transit of vehicles, but also for their internal fleet. CP has started converting their fleet vehicles that work their rail lines to electrics. The Ford Lightning's a prime example of a work vehicle that electrified is a great solution and probably has a really good ROI depending on your use case. So now they've got EV charging infrastructure there. And then when they finally get to the destination, which is the dealership, we've worked with dealers across Canada, Ford, GM, Chev, Hyundai, Acura, you name it. We've provided fast charging and level 2 charging infrastructure for those dealers, because then once they finally do arrive to Ford dealers want a great delivery experience. So they're going to top those vehicles up to 100% before that end user, the consumer, picks up their vehicle. And then, then we're into the infrastructure we talked about earlier. Now, hopefully there's a charger at their home. Hopefully there's a charger at their work. And that's the type of infrastructure we're talking, really to solve this problem that we're having around EV charging infrastructure.
The infrastructure. We can't have a conversation about EVs and anything to do with roads, or even infrastructure isn't only about the highways. It's about the charging. It's about the ratios you had mentioned, the IEA, and something to do with California. Can you tell everyone a little bit about that side of things?
Sure. I mean, infrastructure is key, and I think the CAA actually sponsored our panel on Monday that I spoke at, and they released a report relatively recently, I think just a couple of weeks ago, that surveyed EV owners. And, EV owners were typically, saying they were really enjoyed their vehicles, were thrilled with their vehicles, would probably not go back to driving an internal combustion engine vehicle. But even, with as much as they liked their vehicles, they were still very concerned about the charging infrastructure. And, we've always said as an industry that charging infrastructure, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg issue, but the charging infrastructure really needs to be in place to provide consumers with the confidence that they can buy a vehicle. And, just like a gasoline station, they can find a place relatively easy to charge it when they need to charge it. Because right now, it's still a situation where, you don't see signs on the side of the highway saying that, in most cases anyway, saying there's an EV charging station at the next exit, like you do gasoline signs. And it's really a situation too as well. How much is the right amount of infrastructure? And, from our perspective, you mentioned the International Energy Agency. I think their sort of benchmark is that jurisdictions should have one sort of EV charging station for every 9 EVs on the road. I think Europe has a slightly different metric. I might get my numbers mixed up, but they're either 1 in 10 or 1 in 7, and California is either 1 in 7 or 1 in 10. I forget which is which off the top of my head. But, even if you look at California, it's a jurisdiction, much smaller than Canada is as a nation. Same number of vehicles on the road, but they're suggesting that even with their smaller geographic footprint, and again, I forget the ratio, but it's either 7 to 1 or 10 to 1. And Canada, in terms of the analysis that Natural Resources Canada has undertaken to look at this, has suggested, we think 24 to 1 is the right ratio. And we have a hard time as an industry seeing how that could be possible, given that we're a much larger jurisdiction, a colder jurisdiction in the wintertime when there tends to be battery degradation. So, we believe we need a lot more than the 24 to 1 ratio that's been suggested in consultants' reports to the federal government. One last thing I would say on it is that I think you almost need to overbuild the infrastructure at the front end to provide consumers with that confidence. Some of those stations ultimately may not be needed and could potentially be decommissioned. You don't want to put in infrastructure needlessly, but if we really want to encourage consumer adoption, then consumers need to know that they can charge their vehicle wherever. And for people that live in a detached home and have a garage and can put a charging station in their garage, it's you're going to do. The statistics are 80% of the people do most of their charging at home. Well, if you have a home that accommodates that, that's great. But there are 30% of Canadians that live in, multi-unit rental buildings, and that's a different proposition to try and get chargers in those. So, what we really need is the regulations to be updated to ensure that anytime builders are building new condos, new MERBs, what have you, that part of the building requirement is that you at least build in the capability to put charging stations into those units, because it's way easier to put the units in once you have the carve out done to ensure that the stations can be deployed in the buildings than trying to retrofit them after the fact.
Do you think it should be up to the manufacturers to create the infrastructure? When you look at Tesla, they have the Tesla superchargers. There's the Volkswagens of the world, and there's the other Honda and Toyota. I guess, when you look at it, when you have the Essos and the Petro-Canada, they don't have their own make and models of cars. So I guess, throwing it out there, do you think that there should be maybe universal charging, and should it be up to the manufacturer to work, with these things?
Yeah, I mean, and you raised Tesla, and Tesla's an interesting example, because if you look at their whole business model was predicated, I mean, they're a new car company. Their only product is electric vehicles. So for their business model to work, they need to have they absolutely need to build out their own infrastructure. They weren't saying to government, "Oh, well, we're building an electric car, but you build out the infrastructure for us." But I think for traditional automakers that are involved in this transition, it's hugely capitally expensive to make that transition, to build the vehicles, to build the batteries to support the vehicles. That by and large, manufacturers don't look at it as their job to put the infrastructure in place as well. You have seen some exceptions to that. So Volkswagen, for instance, had a ownership stake, I think they still do, in Electrify America, Electrify Canada, which is responsible for building out some infrastructure. It's not their own particular brand per se, like Tesla is, but those stations would be open to any other EV as well. But that's more the exception than the norm. Typically, what happens is that different manufacturers will collaborate with charging station providers, whether it's Flow or ChargePoint or what have you, to say, okay, well, we've struck an agreement with our with a charging station provider. When a consumer buys their vehicle, that they might get a discounted rate or a certain number of kilometers free with their particular charging station provider. But the real challenge is just there's too many different types of charging station providers out right now as well, which would be no problem if they all sort of operated the same way, and you could pay by credit card, but that's not the
Right.
norm. The norm is that every charging station seems to have a different app that you have to download, and you need
Exactly.
a different card that you might need, so you can have a wallet full of cards, and
Need the adapter to go along with
yeah,
it. Yeah.
some want you to put a deposit down, so that so this sort of thing. So it's certainly not convenient for consumers, the charging infrastructure that we have right now, for sure. And the other challenge that I've experienced myself is just the uptime of the charging infrastructure. There's nothing more frustrating to an EV driver to have 40 kilometers left and go to a fast charger somewhere, only to find out that, oh gee whiz, it's not working. And then you might be hard pressed to find another station that you can get to with the limited range that you still have on your vehicle. So I know that's something we've been encouraging the federal government in their new contracts, where they're trying to encourage doing RFPs for the installation of charging infrastructure, that part of that RFP would be, an uptime requirement, so that these charging stations are maintained, and there is a performance metric built into that contract.
So one of your studies is the electrification, that's a big word, the electrification of your 45-foot fishing boats. You want to electrify those. So last summer was the initial study, I understand. And coming up this summer, the summer of 2024, is it's the feasibility and the infrastructure build. So what will this all look like? How will it come together?
Yeah, so whenever I first started my position here as the energy lead, we started with an energy opportunity assessment, taking down a lot of the data for our community to really understand, our base load and the opportunities that we have, all the different plots of land, to really dial down on some different opportunities. And while we were doing our community engagement events for that, something that was talked about was electric boats. And for me, that was really cool. There's so many other things that need to be done, energy efficiency projects and energy generation projects, but energy or electric boats was something that was really always on my radar, but was more of a long-term goal. And last year at the Smart Energy Conference in Halifax, I was able to meet a company called Remote, and they specialize in fleet electrification. And really, it's a really, really young industry. There's so much uncertainty around it, and there's not a lot of people doing it. But whenever I heard them speak and talk to them afterwards, we both realized how well positioned we were to make a difference in Atlantic Canada and do some work that a lot of other people aren't really doing. So they seen on my vision board that we were talking about electric boats, and it really just worked out perfect. And last summer we were able to acquire some funding to do an initial energy monitoring study, and that really helped us to understand the energy demand on our vessels, to see what they would need for battery storage and things like that. And so now that we have that data this summer, we are hoping to complete a feasibility study on both the vessel electrification as well as the shoreside infrastructure for charging on those vessels. And we're really hopeful that we'll get some really concrete data out of those feasibility studies and really help us understand what it's going to take. We are certainly very aware that it's going to be a really large capital cost, but we're hoping to leverage ourselves as first movers to get some funding and start testing some of this technology, because there's just so many lobster fishing vessels in Atlantic Canada. And if we can get on top of that and start doing some work on the electric side, maybe get an electric vessel, if not the end of this summer, then next summer, we can test the reliability on that and start showing that off to fishermen across the Atlantic and show them that this technology is possible. I would say that there's a lot of controversy around electric vehicles these days. There's a lot of people saying that they aren't proving out in the wintertime and things like that. But one of the big things that we have in our corner with electrifying our vessels is just the fact that we only use those in the wintertime. They don't really have to deal with that excessive cold and excessive drain on them. And there's a lot of technology now that really can seal off the compartments of those batteries. A lot of people ask me, electrifying, water and batteries don't go together well. Well, of course they don't, but there's systems that we can put in place to ensure that that's not going to be affecting our vessels. But certainly for us as a nation, we certainly value the reliability of our infrastructure, and that's going to be number one for us. But as forward thinking as we are, we certainly want to be out there testing them, make sure they're reliable, and hopefully get a fully electrified fleet here in Lennox Island, and add to our energy storage in our community for the 10 months of the year that they're not being used. That's a really, really valuable energy storage that we can have in our community, along with the benefits of having a non-carbon emitting fleet.
Having all of this, these e-buses and the manufacturing side, there's also requires a robust charging infrastructure that's needed. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's actually what my team does.
Mm-hmm.
So I manage the sustainable mobility division of the Lion Electric Company, where our team is responsible for the design, conception, procurement, implementation, and installation of electric vehicle charging. And that goes for both Lion fleets and non-Lion fleets, where really the conceptualization and understanding of how energy is going to be utilized inside the vehicles, but also more broadly and in a societal context as a form of propulsion. Because historically, energy is you use it or you use it or you lose it. It's going to be generated typically at a singular point, like think a Point Lepreau nuclear plant, or think the coal plant in Dartmouth. We're going to be generating large amounts of energy to be consumed. And with a vehicle, we're fundamentally altering that calculation. We are taking that energy and storing it in batteries, and those batteries are then being utilized in vehicles to move either people or product when the vehicles are necessary, and when a customer, or when a school board, or when a company decides that it's going to move product. Now, this also leads us to a wide variety of opportunities, because our vehicles are V2G compliant. V2G means vehicle to grid. That means our batteries are not just methods of propulsion for vehicles. We're actually utilizing our vehicles to backfill the grid. Whenever the grid requires energy, we can install, design, and deploy bidirectional charging installations, which are two-way flow of electricity through a charger. It means we can power the vehicle with the charger, or if there's a storm or an outage or a period of intensely high demand, we can push power back from the vehicles onto the grid.
Is there a portable way to charge an electric car?
There are some kinds of things. There's a company, as an example, called Spark Charge. So Spark Charge makes like batteries that you could it's like a little Lego set. You could charge the battery, plug it in, and then they can, because the batteries are heavy, you could stack one on top of the other. So you could ultimately take these, put them in the back of a car, and take them to another car to charge. But it's not. I'm not 100% sure that there's a giant need for this. I'm sure people ask you the same thing. Well, what do you do when you run out of electricity? And you go, I don't run out of electricity. It doesn't.
You
That's
plan
not the
for
way.
it ahead of time.
Yeah, I don't. I the same that you, if you were
Run out of gas.
if you were down to an eighth of a tank and you were hitting the last part of your journey, and it was some dusty road in the backwoods, you would fill up before you got on there, because you know enough to make sensible decisions. And it's a rarity that people run out of. So we don't really, but I know people are trying all kinds of things. They have them. You could put a pretty big truck mounted battery. I just don't know, to be quite honest with you, that while it's not impossible, that there's a demand. And then, of course, the idea to put a diesel generator on the back of a vehicle to charge a battery, to charge an electric car, this sounds like the opposite of everything we're trying to do for the environment. And so, I mean, we'll see how this works out. Listen, we have the automobile associations that do rescue people. Maybe there is there's a place for that, but you and I know that not too many of us are finding ourselves with no electricity. That just mostly isn't happening. And keep in mind that even if the electricity stopped at your house and you couldn't charge there, you could drive the vehicle somewhere else where there was electricity. There are options for you.
There are.
Yeah. So the answer is yes, and we'll see how. I wouldn't wait too much for that to happen.
Yeah, I think it's really cool because, just like we can wirelessly charge our phones,
Right.
you don't have to plug it in. Do you see that eventually happening down the road for EVs as well? Like where you can just kind of hover over a section on a piece of pavement and charge your car without plugging it in.
Exactly.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's futuristic. It's it's interesting. It's fascinating, and like as I said, the research and development is going on. So we may see it, like if it becomes feasible for government agencies or for private industry. If it becomes feasible, then it can happen. So let me give you an example. What we see right now in terms of smart mobility solutions, or previously it was known as ITS, which is Intelligent Transportation System. The background of this ITS is also very interesting because it started as smart highways. So they tested a section of the highway where they have installed in California. I'm talking where they have installed these radars or detection system where you can guide the vehicle and it can run itself with that technology. But over the time it has evolved, and we see more and more like smart vehicles instead of smart highways. So you never know where the shift is going to be, but the objective is to again make the transportation more safer, more efficient, and smart, and sustainable. So those are the ideas, and what we see is that is a big push. Again, as I said, from having a personal vehicle to either having a shared vehicle or going to the sustainable modes of transportation, which are more walking, bicycling, and using public transit.
Thank you for listening today. Give a listen while you're here to our other podcasts on our website, reimaginedenergy.com, or our YouTube channel. The fine folks who sponsor this podcast is the Smart Energy event, which is held annually in Halifax and in Vancouver. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. Bye for now.